Hi, I'm Tynan Power, and my Dark Side of Data presentation is about Avi Rubin's Tech Talk, All Your Devices Can Be Hacked. Avi Rubin is a professor of computer science and technical director of the Information Security Institute at Johns Hopkins University. He presented this TED Talk in October 2011. In the talk, he discussed a number of ways that researchers have actually been able to hack into common technologies to basically see what the potential is for the security risk. One of the examples he gave that I found very disturbing was about implanted medical devices. In the example he gave, researchers placed a defibrillator into a bundle of meat to mimic implantation because, of course, they could not get a human being to volunteer to be subject to this experiment. They were able to change the patient data, treatment, and turn the device off. The scope of the problem here is that there are 10,000 implanted defibrillators every month and 3 million pacemakers worldwide. The first long-term implanted glucose monitor ever since is expected to be submitted to the FDA for approval this fall, and all of these things have the potential to be hacked. So basically the risk is that networked and wireless capacity allows these implanted devices to be controlled externally, which is very helpful because it means doctors don't need to go in and take the device out and make changes to it every time they need to change treatment. But it also means that they're vulnerable to hackers. Another example that he didn't give, but which came to my mind, is the risk area of potentially hacking digital hearing aids. This came to my mind because I'm somebody who wears digital hearing aids, and I'm familiar with how they work and a little bit about what their potential risks are. Digital hearing aids are designed to be programmed and reprogrammed to match an individual's specific hearing loss. And this is extremely helpful for people with hearing loss because it means that you don't have to get new hearing aids every time your hearing loss changes. Wireless capacities can aid in programming and also allow connections to other devices such as phones. This is, again, extremely helpful because if you can imagine wearing a hearing aid and then also trying to use some kind of listening device like headphones or earbuds or even holding up a telephone next to the hearing aids, they frequently, the communications devices don't actually talk well to each other, and therefore it's very problematic for people with hearing loss. It's a lot easier if the sound can actually be streamed directly to the hearing aids, which are already in place like earbuds that are custom made to fit your ear. So it's really a great boon for people with hearing loss. There are 3.13 million hearing aids that were sold in 2015, and 87.5% of them have wireless capabilities. The risk here is that digital hearing aids could potentially be hacked to stream or record all sound passing through them, which is quite a big risk when you think about the number of people who wear these hearing aids, with 3.13 million sold just in 2015 and of course many more in other years. That's a lot of people at risk. Another example that Rubin gave is of hacking automobiles. Connected cars make connection easier for hackers too. Researchers hacked cars at close range using Wi-Fi and Bluetooth capabilities, and longer range using cell phone and radio networks. They were able to change the speedometer reading, stop the car, and disable the brakes. The vulnerabilities here in these vehicles are Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, radio, even sensors and tires. All 12 major car manufacturers offer Bluetooth in at least some of their vehicles, and there are 60 to 100 sensors in each new car. The risk here is that individuals can hack cars, leaving you responsible for the results, like speeding, if they set the speedometer to appear to be going the correct speed limit when you're actually exceeding it. They can steal the car by accessing and overriding systems, or manipulate your vehicle to injure you or others. Another example that Rubin gave, which was a little bit of a strange example I thought, is of picking up entries on smartphones. The example he gave had researchers recording video of people who were on buses and being able to discern what was being typed on the smartphones even when they couldn't actually see the entries being made. I found this to be a little bit of a strange example because it seemed less about how data was being used in a way that was not how it was originally intended, and much more about how video cameras, which are all over the place, could be used to pick up all kinds of things, which seems to be a slightly different kind of case than the other things he was describing. There are, of course, 1.91 billion smartphone users estimated in 2016, so this is a very large population that can be hacked. And In this case, the risk was that entries on smartphones could be picked up by video recording devices as we move about in the world. And of course, there's so many video devices out in the world recording for security purposes and other purposes that would be actually very difficult to avoid ever being within the view of one of these cameras. Another example that Rubin gave was of P25 radios, which is something that I was not familiar with, but P25 radios are apparently devices that are frequently used by police and other emergency personnel for real-time communication, a little bit like a walkie-talkie, a little bit like a cell phone. Researchers used a toy that uses the same frequency, a texting device for children made by a company called Girl Talk, to hack the P25. This is a device that was readily available in toy stores. There are at least 1,299 P25 systems in use in the United States. Not devices, systems. And that means that there are quite a lot of these machines out there in the world that have the potential to be hacked. The risk is that in an emergency situation, such as a shooting, communications could be intentionally jammed. And confidential information that is accidentally not encrypted could also be obtained and shared. Rubin's final example was of picking up keystrokes. In this example, Rubin showed that researchers had discovered that highly sensitive accelerometers that are in our smartphones can pick up keystrokes, not just within themselves, but at the nearby computers. And therefore, by just simply having the phone near a computer, they were able to actually determine what was being typed on the computer. Again, the scope here is 1.91 billion smartphone users, and just think of how many of us actually lay our phones close to our computers while we're working, or whether we're in a place where many people are working on computers, we could have our phone on our table, and at the next table over, somebody else is working on a computer, and their keystrokes are actually able to be picked up. So basically, the risk here is that smartphone accelerometers can be used to eavesdrop on nearby text. And yet, at the same time, these same improvements in technology are what makes it possible for smartphones to be used to detect seismic activity, as they are starting to be, and also to detect dangerous atrial fibrillation in their users, which is another new development in things that they can do with cell phones now that they have such really finely tuned accelerometers. So the benefits are that these devices actually can make our lives much more convenient. They can detect threats to our health and safety. They can build databases that reveal new information that would not have been possible without big data. And yet the risks are real, that there are vulnerabilities that endanger our privacy, public safety, and personal safety. And of course, we have to weigh those benefits and those risks. I think for most of us, the potential for the risks ends up feeling much more unusual and much more unlikely, where the benefits are very immediate for us, and therefore I think it is frequently very hard to actually measure those two things against each other, because we're less aware of the risks and we're less aware of how they are actually being taken advantage of, while we're so much more aware of the benefits of these technologies. If you're interested in this subject and you still have the stomach for it after hearing about all those potential threats, you might be interested in looking at Avi Rubin's other TED Talk done in 2015 called The Risk of Connectivity, in which he talks about hacking of other common devices like networked home devices and fitness trackers.